Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today, I've got something really exciting to share with you. Nicole over at Nicole's Bookish Nook has come up with this wonderful 2025 readathon, and she's calling it the 2025 Celtophile Readathon. So she's inviting all of us fellow booktubers to take part in this wonderful readathon and embrace the Celtic imagination. She's decided to interpret Celtic much more loosely as well. So while there will be a particular focus, of course, on the Irish tradition, she's broadened it right out to include, of course, the Celtic traditions of Scotland, of Wales, of Cornwall, and of course there was a grand Celtic tradition over in the continent as well, particularly before the Roman period. So the Celtic tradition as defined by all of these types of national expression and imagination. And she's divided this readathon into 7 prompts. So I thought I would introduce these prompts as I share with you what I'm going to be reading as part of this wonderful readathon, because Nicole has agreed to take me on, believe it or not, as a co-host. So this is going to be my debut, my first time co-hosting a readathon. I'm very excited about it, but a bit nervous. I am quite technologically illiterate, so I hope I can help Nicole in all the right ways to make this work. We'll see how we go. So the 2025 Celtophile Readathon. Prompt 1, read a book with a green, white or orange cover. Right. I thought I might introduce this wonderful writer from Wales. Miranda Aldhouse-Green is a professor at Cardiff University in Wales. She specialises in the archaeology, the religion, the mythology of Britain in the Iron Age leading into the Roman Age period. So she's done this book, for example, on the Celtic myths. It's a fantastic introduction to Celtic mythology. She's a world authority and expert in her field, but she's also a wonderful communicator. So if you would like to get some hold of some Miranda Aldhouse-Green, she's a very good, and the other great thing about her is she interviews really well. There are lots of interviews on YouTube with her talking about all the books that I'm going to prefigure right now. So this is one. Then she's also done books like this. This is also a terrific book written to a general audience called Sacred Britannia. It's looking at that Iron Age, particularly Iron Age spirituality, spiritual practices in Britain, so before the Roman conquest, and then how they were dealt with and treated during the Roman occupation and the introduction of Christianity into Britain, and how ancient Celtic mythologies even and spirituality morphed into that Christian experience. This is a wonderful book. Once again, written by a world expert in her field, but written for a general audience, and it's a great read. It really is a hoot. And then she's written these other books. And one of her big specialties has been looking at bog bodies, human sacrifice to the gods. So she's written this one, Bog Bodies Uncovered, and this one, Dying for the Gods. Great title, isn't it? So again, these are both books written for a popular audience. They're great books to read, very readable. Very accessible. She's a terrific communicator. And these books in particular, there are some terrific interviews with her on YouTube that you can watch if you're interested in this idea of human sacrifice for the gods, of Iron Age bog bodies and what that was all about. So that's Miranda. I keep forgetting her name. Miranda Aldhouse-Green. Sorry about that. All right, prompt 2. Read a book written by Morgan Llywelyn. Morgan Llywelyn is, I just looked her up online. She's an amazing person. She sounds like an absolute hoot. Born in New York, moved back to Ireland where she became a citizen of the Irish Republic. So that's where she lives now, just outside of Dublin apparently. And apparently she's a wonderful writer of particularly YA fantasy novels, and always looking at that, their roots in Celtic mythology. I don't have any Morgan Llywelyn, so to read one of those, I'm going to have to save up some pennies and buy one. So maybe I do love Celtic-based, fantasy based on Celtic mythology. So I'm sure I would love Morgan Llywelyn. I'll see how I go. Prompt 3. Read a book written by a native-born Celtic author. Well, finally, I'm going to get to the poetry. I couldn't do a video with any sort of prefiguring about Celtic work without looking at the terrific, the insurpassable Seamus Heaney. I've got this wonderful biography by Helen Vendler, and then of course the new and selected poems. I have done a video already several videos ago on Seamus Heaney's majestic alliterative verse translation of Beowulf. So you can watch that if you would like to do something on Beowulf and Seamus Heaney's alliterative verse translation of that grand epic poem. But I thought for this read I might return to the poetry and to Helen Vendler's fantastic biography. These are all books that I have read, but some of them I haven't read for a long time, so I'm really looking forward to revisiting these books as I work my way through this readathon. The other poet that I wanted to explore with you is a Scottish poet, the great Orkney poet, George Mackay Brown. Mackay Brown has featured in several of my videos. He's a Scottish poet who I love. My name should actually be Gordon Hall hyphenated, but several or a couple of generations ago, the hyphen was dropped. So all boys in my family are Gordon in their middle name, and then Hall is our surname. So my name is Philip Aaron Gordon Hall. And as I said, it should be Gordon Hall hyphenated, because my family, the side of my family that were not Jewish, they were from the Scottish Highlands, and they were from Clan Gordon apparently, and they migrated out to Australia several generations ago. So my name should be Gordon Hall hyphenated, and my family has very strong cultural heritage links to Clan Gordon up in the Scottish Highlands there. They've always been very proud of this Scottish Highlands connection. I would love to return to Scotland one day and explore the Highlands and see the country of Clan Gordon. We'll see how we go. But I thought for this particular thing, I'm going to look at the Orkney poet, George Mackay Brown. The Orkney Islands, those little islands just off the north coast of Scotland, so heading up into Scandinavia. And of course, they were settled by the Vikings in that period when the whole of northern England and Scotland, of course, was part of what was called the Danelaw, the Viking world. Mackay Brown does a lot of work in his poetry, exploring that Celtic mythology, the Viking mythology in particular, because, they were so settled by the Vikings after the Roman period. And Mackay Brown had a lot of problems with alcohol. He died quite young. He literally drunk himself to death, unfortunately. But as an adult, he rejected his Presbyterian faith completely. He hated that idea of that Calvinist despotic God, you're predestined to heaven or to hell by this all-powerful creative being. Mackay Brown rejected that, and as an adult, when he wanted to return to his Christian faith, he returned to a Catholic expression of faith, and he had a really mystical Catholic experience of faith. Really interesting guy. So in his poetry, he often explores Celtic, Catholic, Viking mythology, spirituality. He's a wonderful poet. He's written some wonderful poems, really celebrating the Orkney Islands, his family growing up in the Orkneys, his father in particular. He's a wonderful poet. So I'm going to be revisiting the collected poems. And then I've got here, You know, there's the autobiography of the man. You can see him there. He's one of my favourite poets of all time. I really am devoted to this poet. I've got this particular biography of George Mackay Brown by Maggie Ferguson. And then there's this is a really interesting book by Ron Ferguson. Ron Ferguson, this is sort of a spiritual biography of George Mackay Brown. So really looking at his conversion to Catholicism as an adult and that sort of mystical Catholic experience of religion that he had. This is a fabulous book. Ron Ferguson was a really interesting bloke. He actually has strong ties as a priest, I think, on the island of Iona. And he did a lot of work with Catholic high Anglican spirituality centered on that holy island of Iona. And then he was quite a few years, he was actually a priest on the Orkney Islands, which apparently where he now lives still. And he is a retired priest now. I'm not sure whether he was Catholic or Anglican. I suspect he was high Anglican. But this is a wonderful book. If you like, it's a spiritual biography on George Mackay Brown. It's a book I love, and I can't wait to reread it for this tag, this read-along. And this is another one, Alison Gray. Alison Gray, this is another spiritual biography of George Mackay Brown. She did a PhD on the Oxford movement, that high Anglican expression of faith centering around, of course, Oxford University in the 1830s. You know, and it's born such people as William Pusey and John Henry Newman, all sorts of people. It's a thing that I've always been very attracted to. I'm very, very drawn to reading the Tractarians, as they were also called, these high Anglican priests who put out these pamphlets or tracts on matters of faith and high church spirituality. This is another wonderful book on the, if you like, a spiritual biography of George Mackay Brown. All right, where are we up to? Prompt 4, read a fiction or a non-fiction book about Ireland. Well, I couldn't help myself returning to this. This is a book by Thomas Cahill. He's a popular historian, and this is a book he's written called How the Irish Saved Civilization. When I first bought and read this about 20 years ago, I know I absolutely loved it. So I can't wait to reread this book for this readathon. This is a book that tells the story of how after the collapse of the Roman Empire and we went into the so-called Dark Ages, you know, when so many communities right across Europe lost literacy, maybe lost, you know, certainly more sophisticated practices of pottery, of glass making, you know, of building out of stone, because they returned to the simple wooden buildings. So this is a wonderful book that explores how after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Latin as a language and Latin literature, spirituality, religion, theology, it was all kept and preserved in monasteries by the Irish Church. And during the so-called Dark Ages, it was the Irish Church that saved, that continued Latin literature, theology, and kept it all going. You know, the translations of the Bible into Latin and the study of the Latin Bible and all of these things. So this is a wonderful book written for a popular audience about how the Irish saved civilization from the Dark Ages after the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's a wonderful book, and I can't wait to read it again, and I'll share my thoughts with you as part of this readathon. Prompt 5, read a Celtic fantasy novel. Well, there wouldn't be anything like that, would there? There wouldn't be any contemporary fantasy novels with their roots in the Celtic tradition. The first one I thought I would share with you is this series of Artemis Fowl books, which I've recently just bought. Very cheap. I got this whole series for just 40 Australian dollars. I couldn't believe it. There's 8 books in this series. The Artemis Fowl is written by Ian Colfer, this Irish YA fantasy writer, and they're just fantastic. Artemis Fowl is this absolute sly comic character. He's almost an anti-hero. He's a bit of a villain, but He's also a really interesting guy. You know, these books are funny, they're adventurous, they're YA fantasy, an absolute hoot. So I'll share this with you as I read these 8 books. I haven't read these for years, but I know I'm going to really enjoy returning to Artemis Fowl. They're an absolute hoot. Contemporary Irish YA fantasy literature. And the next one I thought I would share with you just quickly is Susan Cooper. Susan Cooper was an English writer from Cornwall, and she wrote this wonderful series called The Dark is Rising sequence. This is a retelling of the Arthurian myths and legends into sort of 1950s, 1960s Cornwall. So this is very much that Cornwall, that Cornish Celtic experience. I'm looking particularly at Arthur and Merlin and all that sort of thing. These are absolutely brilliant. I've just recently upgraded my Susan Coopers to these wonderful hardback books. They're on quite cheap paper, but they open beautifully in their hands. They're a beautiful reading experience. I originally had The Dark is Rising in cheap second-hand paperbacks, which literally the poor things just fell apart because I'd reread them so many times. So I upgraded my Susan Cooper library to these quite nice hardbacks. They've got beautiful matching covers, so they look beautiful on my shelves. And I like to read these or reread these all every 3 to 5 years. So I'm really looking forward to returning to these again as part of this readathon. I'll tell you what I think of them. Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising. They're just fabulous. She was also, as I said, she was actually a Cornish English writer, but she lived most of her adult life in the United States after marrying an American. And she's still alive. She also interviews really well. Lots of interviews with Susan Cooper on YouTube, for example, talking about The Dark is Rising and all the other things she's written. She's written some adult fantasy, but she's predominantly YA fantasy. And the things that I particularly love of hers are those Dark is Rising, these retelling of the Arthurian myths and legends into post-World War II Cornwall. Prompt 6, read a fiction or non-fiction book about Celtic myths, legends, or tales. Oh boy. I've got this beautiful book by Aidan Cremen on the Celts. It's again, you know, she's a world authority on Celtic mythology, history, archaeology, but she's written this book as a wonderful introduction for the general reader. I'm going to return, I bought this from the Folio Society, and you know about my addiction to the Folio Society. This is the wonderful historical work on the Celts by Nora Chadwick. This is a book that I had in, a cheap paperback from a secondhand bookshop for years, and it again was really just falling apart. So when I discovered that the Folio Society were doing their own beautiful edition of this book, I had to buy it. I just love Nora Chadwick's book, and getting the Folio edition, you know, they just open so beautifully in their hands. They're richly illustrated, you know, with amazing photographs. And Nora Chadwick brings together the whole history and archaeology of Celtic Europe so well. This is a majestic read. And I haven't read my Folio edition yet, so that's going to be a real hoot to read Nora Chadwick finally in my Folio edition. And I'll be able to retire my cheap second-hand paperback edition that I have always lived with. And then, of course, I've got the Welsh mythology. I have 4 adult children, and all 4 of them, I found their names in the Welsh Mabinogion. So, yes, mythology, Welsh mythology, Celtic mythology has always meant a lot to me. All 4 of my children's names came from this book, the Mabinogion, the great work of Welsh Celtic mythology. So I've got this book here by Gwyn Jones, Welsh Legends and Folk Tales, and this beautiful book here by also Gwyn Jones and Thomas Jones. So they're wonderful translations / retelling of the Mabinogi and the Welsh myths and legends into modern day English. They're an absolute hoot. The source book of all 4 of my children's names, the Welsh Mabinogion. Oh boy. And 7, the final prompt, read a Celtic historical novel. Well, for me, I'm going to return to George Mackay Brown. He was predominantly a poet. That's what he's predominantly remembered for. But he did write a few novels, and one of them is this wonderful novel called Magnus. Magnus was this, in that post-Viking world, in that early middle medieval period, he was a earl in the Orkneys, and there were the two brothers, if in a sense, fighting for the crown, and Magnus was murdered. So it's sort of like that, the brothers in the tower type thing. He was buried in the foundations of the Catholic cathedral in the Orkney Islands. But this is a book, as is always with George Mackay Brown, it's such a quirky retelling of this story of Magnus, the historical figure, this Viking Scottish warrior, if you like, who was murdered by his brother. This also brings in the tradition of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that incredible German priest who literally died for his opposition to Hitler in the closing days of World War II. They arrested him and hanged him. They knew things were, the writing was on the wall, and Hitler was rounding up people that he wanted to get killed before they lost the war, and they wouldn't be able to get their revenge on these people. Terrible story. So this is a book about sacrifice, about what do you believe in, and are you willing to die for what you believe in. It's a book about spirituality, sacrifice, all sorts of things, particularly focusing on this guy called Magnus, who became a type of a saint in that Scottish Celtic Catholic tradition, and looking at Magnus alongside a reflection on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's a wonderful novel about spirituality, sacrifice, and what everything means. It's a beautiful novel. I love it. So I can't wait to reread it for this and tell you what I think. I haven't read this again for years, and it's been at least 20 years since I've read this book, so I can't wait to reread it. So that is the 2025 Celtophile Readathon. Thank you, Nicole at NicolesBookishNook. If you don't know her channel, look it up. Nicole is a wonderful writer of poetry, of fantasy and horror novels. So as well as being a booktuber, she's a writer, and she loves sharing all of these things on her channel. And now she's sharing with all of us this 2025 Celtophile Readathon, and she's even agreed to take me on board as a co-host. I'm going to tag a lot of people at the bottom of this description to take part in this tag, so please make sure you tag Nicole and me when you make your videos, because we would love to watch them. And I'm a bit technologically illiterate, but I'll see if I can work out how to reshare videos, and we'll get it out there to the world. This great celebration of the Celtic imagination. Can there be anything better on BookTube in 2025 than a celebration of the Celtic imagination? Thank you, and bye for now.